Hey folks, Fred Delory here, and welcome back to another episode of On Background, an iPolitics podcast where we, sit around and tell stories while we check our partisanship at the door as best we can. Though I'm the first to admit that's not always easy. As the former national campaign manager for the Conservative Party, I love hearing stories from the other side and adding my own when relevant. So this month, we're approaching the 1-year anniversary of a series of by-elections that took place across Canada. So what could be more fun than sitting down with one of those MPs that was elected for the first time a year ago and talking to them about their journey, what they've been up to, and maybe what's next. So I'm excited to have Liberal MP Ben Carr, the Member of Parliament for Winnipeg South Centre, and the recently named Chair of the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, and one of a handful of Liberal MPs from the Prairies. And I'm very interested about chatting more on that specifically. So Ben, thanks so much for coming in. I appreciate that you're just running from committee to be here.
Thanks very much, Fred. Pleasure to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Look, my question right out of the gate is this. What has the last year been like as an MP coming in on a government that's been around for a while? You were a former staffer at one point, and I'd like to talk more about that as well. But what was it like? You came in, you were elected a year ago this month. What was life? What's life been like?
Well, it's interesting. I was a teacher, and I ended up teaching at the high school that I was a student at. So you end up going and calling all of your former teachers by their first name. I was a staffer, and now all of a sudden people I was calling minister back then, I'm calling by their first name. So there was a familiarity in terms of caucus. I had a lot of friends, a lot of familiar faces to lean upon in terms of helping me to understand what I had gotten myself into. But it's been a learning curve. It's been fascinating. I think one of the most challenging things has been that about 3 weeks after I took my seat in the House of Commons, the terrorist attacks in Israel took place on October 7th. And I represent the largest Jewish population in Western Canada, and I'm a Jew myself. So within 3 weeks of effectively being a member of Parliament, I was thrust into what is arguably the most difficult, challenging, contentious public policy issue that a politician can face. So it was certainly trial by fire early on. So that was one of the first things that I had to contend with. And once I found my footing a little bit, you start to have to familiarize yourself with your committee responsibilities. How do you manage your travel between your riding and Ottawa? Where do you book in the time to speak with constituents? So it's been a fascinating journey in the last year, but I think I had a bit of an advantage over members of Parliament that perhaps had not had any exposure to Parliament Hill, because I had a pretty fundamental understanding of what this place looks like, but albeit in a different role.
Right. And when were you a staffer here? It was during the government? Were you in opposition before?
So I had a couple of stints. So I was a Carleton student.
Right.
And when I was working at Carleton, I worked for Reg Alcock, who some listeners may remember was the president of the Treasury Board in the Martin government. And I was working for Reg part-time and finishing my studies. I then ended up managing a couple of different leadership campaigns. So I worked for Scott Bryson's first leadership campaign when Scott ran for Liberal leader, not PC leader.
No, that was one of the most heartbreaking floor crossings I've ever experienced, was when Scott left our party for the Liberal Party. That hurt.
I can imagine.
I was a young conservative, a Nova Scotian like him. I didn't support him in his PC leadership. I supported my MP, Peter MacKay, in that one. But I became, friends with Scott at some level. And that hurt when he left. So you ran his campaign. I didn't realize that.
Well, I didn't run his campaign. I ran the Manitoba campaign for his federal leadership. Proud to say, by the way, that we had more delegates for Scott in Manitoba than in any province other than Nova Scotia.
Then maybe you should have ran the whole country for him.
It was a really cool experience. As you know, Scott's he's a smart guy. He's an affable guy. He's a lot of fun to be around. And then I actually ended up doing the same thing for Bob Ray's leadership a couple of years later in 2008.
Okay.
And I ended up working for the party. Actually, sorry, the Bob leadership would have been a little bit later. I ended up working for the party in the Dion election in elections readiness. So I had a couple of stints with the party
in Manitoba.
No, here. In elections readiness,
Okay.
I worked. It was at 55 Metcalf was the old, or was it 81 Metcalf? I don't remember. It was one or the other. One of the Metcalfs was Chrétien's old law office, and I remember the address because I would go every month and say, "Is Mr. Chrétien there? Is Mr. Chrétien there? I just want 5 minutes. Can I just sit down
Just
with
to
Mr.
meet him?"
Chrétien?" I had met him a couple times. I wrote him a letter when I was in university at Simon Fraser. I did a quick stint there, and my friend Richard said, "Put your phone number at the bottom of the letter." I said, "Why would I do that?" And he said, just see what happens. And one day, I'm sitting in my dorm room, and I get this call. "Hello, Ben?" I'm thinking,
Wow.
And he goes, "It's Jean Chrétien." And of course, you think it's like a buddy of yours is pranking you or something. No, it was Prime Minister Chrétien, post-prime ministership. And we had a lovely chat. And anyway, so that's why I remember the Metcalf addresses, because I used to try to go see him. And I eventually did a couple of years later. But I was working at the party at that point in time. And it was then some years later that I came back to Ottawa in 2015, and I started my role as the Director of Parliamentary Affairs to Mélanie Joly, who at the time was the Minister of Canadian Heritage. So I was here for the 2015 to 2017 period.
Right. So from there, you're back teaching, and obviously the by-elections are called. You were teaching then, right? When these were?
No, I was when I went back to Winnipeg in 2017, I'd been teaching prior to that.
Okay.
Then I started as what's called the divisional principal. So I was a senior administrator in one of the school divisions in the northwest part of the city.
Education.
That's right. Then I was a school principal. So I was a high school principal for about 4 years.
Okay.
I left. Pandemic was pretty grueling. I didn't have a vice principal. It was a very challenging time to be in education. I ended up starting an organization called Indigenous Strategy Alliance with a friend of mine, Rebecca Chartrand. And Rebecca's an Indigenous woman from a reserve community in Manitoba. I'm a white Jew from an urban community in Winnipeg. And we thought this is what reconciliation looks like when folks like us are working together. But that didn't last very long because, as you know, my dad passed away, which created a vacancy in the seat, and I had a difficult decision to make. Ultimately, I made the decision that I was going to seek the candidacy for the Liberal Party, and that by-election was held in June of last year. Mm-hmm. So that's when I was elected.
So your father, was he first? When was he first elected federally? Was it 15?
Yeah, he was elected in the 2015 election and subsequently reelected in 19 and 21. When I was born, he ran for the Manitoba Liberal Party in Tuxedo, actually, the riding we were just talking about, which was then held by soon-to-be Progressive Conservative Premier Gary Filmon. So my dad ran against the leader. And he lost, and then in 1988 ran again and was successful. This was a fascinating time in Manitoba politics. I'm not sure how well you may know that history, but this was the Sharon Carstairs election.
Senator.
Who subsequently became a senator and the leader of the government in the Senate. But Sharon was elected from Nova Scotia, actually, originally. Was elected in 1988. She became the first female leader of the opposition of any province in the country.
Wow.
And it was a minority government. And why is that historically important? If you know your history, what was happening in the country in 88, 89, 90 was Meech Lake. So Manitoba was one of the provinces that actually killed Meech, along with Newfoundland and Labrador. And in part it was because of the success that Sharon had had. My dad was deputy leader of the Manitoba
So he's
Liberal
an MLA
Party.
at this time.
That's right. So he was an MLA from 88 to 92. And then he left. He became the chief editorial writer for the Winnipeg Free Press for 5 years. Then he founded the Business Council of Manitoba in 1997, and he served there all the way up until he stepped down in order to present himself as a candidate in late 2013.
Okay. So he got pulled into the Trudeau mania at the time to come back into elected politics.
Yeah, I think he was looking for something new. Before the business council job, which he loved, he used to joke with Gary Dewar, who was the longtime premier of Manitoba.
And conservative appointee to Ambassador.
Very smart appointment by Stephen Harper. Very smart.
Minority governments.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, Gary's got a place, a cabin 5 minutes from ours.
Okay.
And a couple times a year he comes over for a beer on the deck, and we talk about those days when I was much younger and don't remember everything, so he fills me in, and then we talk a little bit more. And his whole family are now constituents of mine, actually. So I get to run into Gary every now and then. But it was an interesting time then. But my dad would say to Gary, you know, I've got the best job in the province next to you, and he really, really loved his time at the business council, but prior to that, his job stints were kind of 5-year segments. And I think that at the end of that 17-year tenure, and knowing where the shift in the country was going, and knowing that this was probably going to be the last big career move that he was going to make at that stage of his life, because he was 63 at that time, he decided that was the right moment to put his name in the ring.
Right. I remember when he was elected in 15, it was an election I lost in, but he was a big name for the prairies. Like, he was the guy. Like, I remember hearing, like, there was this guy, this liberal, Jim Carr, who's a big deal. And the prime minister eventually made him like special representative to the prairies, which I thought was a really interesting, it's almost like a Quebec lieutenant, right? An historic role in our confederation.
Yeah. Oh, and part of that was that when my dad got sick, he wasn't able to fulfill all of the duties that a cabinet minister must fulfill.
Right.
But the prime minister felt he was very valuable to the team, and he was. So the special representation to the prairies was a way for the prime minister to keep him close, while being able to offer him a little bit more balance to take care of his health than he would have been afforded if he had had a full seat around the cabinet table. Right.
I'm interested, given the Liberals, that's the one region of the country where they traditionally have been weak for many, many decades. It almost feels maybe they should have something like that permanent, where they try to rebuild their party in some ways, and that, or at least have a representative when they're in government. I know the Quebec lieutenant thing, obviously it's the culture, the English and the French thing that's important, but it feels like maybe that's something that party should consider in that area.
Well, I think he brought a lot of value to the role, and certainly left a lot behind in terms of vision and aspiration for the Prairie region. But I don't disagree with you. I think that there is certainly a role to play. And when you come from a part of the country that is less substantially represented than in other parts.
Six and 3 big provinces.
There are 6 of us, that's right.
Big and 2
so
provinces.
Yeah, so you have to find ways to stick out. You know, it's interesting being the MP immediately after
you
him.
replaced your father as a member of Parliament. What is that like? What's that experience been through? Obviously, you've I don't want to go too far here, but you lost your father, and then you go into, there's this opportunity. I shouldn't say opportunity. I think you were dragged into this. If I heard correctly, you weren't so maybe keen on running, and that you were pushed to do it, or
no? I wouldn't say that's accurate. I mean,
okay.
I certainly had to give some thought to whether or not this is what I wanted to do, and that's a very difficult decision to make when you're grieving
100%.
a huge loss. I mean, my dad was my best friend. We were very, very close. So to have to decide on such a huge decision on a professional and a personal level, and it happened really quickly. Like, he died on December 12th in 2022, and I got a call from, I wasn't super pleased about this. I got a call from a CBC reporter 2 weeks later saying he had heard I was thinking about it, or someone had tipped him off to something, and I had to start talking about it. And then what happens, of course, is, and you know how nomination contests work, well, now somebody else feels some pressure. So there is a sitting city councilor. She's still a sitting city councilor in Winnipeg, who put her name in the ring. And now you're saying to yourself, oh, okay, I'm trying to grieve here. I'm trying to sort my head out. I'm not in a particularly clear headspace.
People are out selling memberships and working it, right?
People are working. And I have to make a decision pretty quick, or otherwise I'm going to fall behind. So I think we've all made big decisions in our lives. And if you're anything like me.
Made one in 15.
If you're anything like me, you can analyze and go over it in your head as much as you want. At the end of the day, you listen to your gut. And my gut told me, see what happens. Put your name forward. This is something that I think I can bring some value to. I think that my life's experiences at that time had set me up to be a representative that could advocate strongly for the things that mattered to the people in the riding that I'm now privileged to represent. And I remember when I was a school principal, there was a piece of art that I had put up in the school, and it said, there was a few actually. I'll quote three of them. One is the classic Gretzky quote, which is, "You miss 100% of the shots you don't take," which is a great quote. One was a Nelson Mandela quote, which is, "I never lose. I either win or learn," which I think is a fantastic quote. And the other is one of those kind of inspirational posters that you see all over the place. And this one said, "A ship is safe in the harbor, but that's not what ships were built for."
Right.
So I had all of those.
You had all these.
I had all those things that are kind of running through my head. So that had to be dealt with. And then, of course, what's interesting is my dad was obviously well known, but both locally and nationally. In fact, just yesterday. Was it yesterday or was it today? It's today. I'm on Spark Street today on my way to a meeting, and a woman comes up to me and she says, "Are you Ben Carr?" And I said, "Yeah." She goes, "Hi, my name's so-and-so. I worked for your dad at Natural Resources." And this happens to me all the time. Right. And in a way, it's very special. It's very meaningful because it keeps his memory alive. And it's actually it's not about you. It makes the other person feel good.
Yes.
To have the opportunity to share a memory of someone that was special to them. And I'm the closest thing to that person.
Right.
So you kind of become a vehicle through which people get to feel good about the time spent with that person. And that's a privilege and a blessing in its own right. Yeah. However, it also never allows you as an individual the opportunity to disassociate when you want to disassociate. Right. So there's two sides to that, but more often than not, it's very warm. And I taught, it's interesting. I gave my dad's eulogy and the Prime Minister was there. And he and I spent about 10 minutes together in a little room at the Centennial Concert Hall in Winnipeg before. And I said, Prime Minister, funny enough, you are the only person in this hall that actually understands what I'm about to do, which was on the precipice of a political career. Right. Give a eulogy about my father. Now, the Prime Minister's political career, of course, came later, many years later. But the point was that you
were weeks into later,
weeks. Right? Well, and this was before I'd announced, but I was thinking about it. But the point is that he deals with that all the time. Less so, I think, now, but everywhere across the country it was, your dad this, Pierre Trudeau that, and so he and I in an interesting way were actually able to bond over having these famous political fathers and how we as their sons operated within their shadow and how we had to try to emerge out of that shadow and chart our own course.
Right. No, it's no easy task. So for that election, it was interesting to me as someone I've been a part of a lot of by-elections for the federal party, working for I worked for Harper for his entire time as Prime Minister, and then the last stint with O'Toole. I'm curious how you felt that election was in terms of the Conservative effort, because it felt like the Conservative Party was leading in the polls. They opened up their lead over the last year. Poilievre has been leader at this point for like 6-7 months. And to me, when it comes to by-elections, governments don't generally do well in by-elections. It's an opportunity for the opposition. It's a protest vote. It's a time because there's nothing really at stake in a lot of ways. And I was disappointed to see, for my party, we we lost ground in a lot of seats, despite being up in the polls, right? And I saw you went up 10 points from the 21 campaign. How did you feel that was on the ground? Did you feel that there was a strategy from the Conservatives or yourselves? Like, what played out there?
Hard to say that I had a feel for what the Conservative strategy was. I would run into their candidate door knocking on the same street, and in passing we would have a brief conversation about how things were going, but I didn't have a really good sense. You're dialed in to your campaign and what you have to do, and really you're just showing up at the office every day and you're knocking on doors. The by-election, I think, to your point, was indicative of typically what we see with by-elections, which is a little bit more apathy, a little bit less engagement. Folks sometimes don't even know until a couple weeks in that there is a by-election.
Right.
So a lot of it was just kind of figuring out where in the community did we feel we had to focus the most, getting a sense of how people were feeling at that point in time. It was really hot in Winnipeg during that month. There was a lot of days where there was smoke in the air from forest fires. So it was a little bit unusual in terms of trying to get the feel for how things were going on the ground. But as you say, I mean, people vote for different reasons, right? I mean, you hear this all the time. Some people vote for a leader. Some people vote for a party. Some people vote for an issue. Some people vote out of protest. Some people vote because their great-grandfather always voted a particular way, and that got passed down through the generations. So it was very fascinating to engage with voters and develop an understanding of why it was that they were coming to the determinations that they were. Right.
So in this election, did you feel at any time that it was that you could lose? Like, it was, because you won by over 50%, right? So it was a strong win.
Yeah, 56% was.
But at the polls at the time, like, the Conservatives were nationally opening up their lead everywhere.
But you never take anything for granted. And what I'm learning heading into what will eventually be a general election, and my first general election as a candidate, is that you start to get nervous a little bit. And I think everybody feels that. I think whether you're a candidate that won by 1% or 100 votes, or you're a candidate that won by 15,000, you always have a little bit of nervousness in terms of how is this going to go? How are people feeling? It can be very difficult at times to gauge the mood. Of course, on particular issues, you hear from constituents, you hear from voters, you get a sense of how they're feeling, but it's not always clear how things are going to go. I knew heading into the by-election that there was a good chance that we were going to be successful, and part of that was as a result of the reception we were getting at the door, the conversations I was having on the phones with people, and by virtue of the fact that I've lived in this riding my entire life, save for the couple years I've lived outside of the city. And I know the people. I know what matters to constituents in Winnipeg South Centre, and I felt as though our campaign then and what I was offering in my candidacy was speaking to the priorities and the interests that they were hoping I would convey to them.
Are the NDP traditionally a decent force in your riding? Were they, like, going back to a number of elections when your father was there, and versus where they are in your by-election, did their numbers shift at all? Or
they went down in this particular election. I think it's a good question. I want to say they went down to something like 14%, maybe from 18%.
Okay.
The one time that the Conservatives won Winnipeg South Centre in the last 50 or 60 years.
Joyce Bateman?
That's right. It was Joyce Bateman, who was a Liberal, by the way, prior to that. In fact, she was
a Conservative in my eyes.
she was supposed to replace Anita Neville, who's now the Lieutenant Governor of Manitoba and was a long-time Liberal member of Parliament after Lloyd Axworthy. But Joyce ended up running for the Conservatives, and that was an election where the NDP rise is what gave way.
2011 campaign.
That's right, is what gave way to a pretty significant split on the left that allowed the Conservative candidate, in this case Joyce, to emerge victorious. Not by a lot, but that's an example of where if the NDP vote surges, it can pose a problem for a Liberal candidate.
Absolutely.
And
that's why you're so lucky with Jagmeet Singh as their leader.
Well, yeah, I do think that Jack Layton had more to offer people. I think that there was a different feeling in the country at the time in relation to the NDP, in relation to their leadership. And of course, the political culture in our country has changed substantially since the 2015 or the 2011 election. But yeah, I would say that it's safe to say that people feel differently about Jagmeet than they did about Jack Layton.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talk about the political culture changing. It has. It's like I've seen it. Like a lot of. But if you look at the regionalism of the parties and where they're strong and where they're not, I'm fascinated. Like obviously you're in a good, strong Liberal seat in the Prairies where there's not many. How big is the Prairie Liberal Caucus? How many is there?
There's four of us.
Four of you.
In Manitoba, there's four of us.
Right.
So myself, Terry Duguid, Dan Vandell, and Kevin Lamrou.
Right.
And then 2 seats in Alberta, being Randy Boissonneau and George Chahal. And then when we meet as a caucus, we meet as a Prairie North caucus. So you add 2 to that list, which would be Michael McLeod from the Territories and Brendan Henley from Yukon.
Right. The Conservatives, I think we used to have with our Atlantic caucus, when we had a bigger Atlantic caucus, I think we had the North included at times in that as well. But it's funny, it's like Conservatives are one region or province where we really traditionally struggle is Quebec. And it feels like for the Liberals, it's the Prairies. That's where you guys are really a small caucus out of a good chunk of seats. What's it like being a Prairie MP and looking at, you're surrounded in blue, a wave of blue?
The Prairies are an interesting place because you have a lot more diversity than I think people understand or care to acknowledge. And part of it does have to do, Fred, with the electoral system. So if you were to look at the popular vote in Saskatchewan and in Alberta, there's far more support for progressive parties. And when I say progressive parties, I'm referring in this instance to the Liberals and the NDP collectively than people may think. So that doesn't always equate to seats. It's also indicative of, I think, the breakdown in the Prairies of an urban-rural divide in the country. And we tend to see that across urban and rural regions across Canada that they split either NDP Liberal in urban or more conservative in rural. And that's nothing new. Winnipeg is interesting because we have 4 Liberals in Winnipeg. We've got 2 Conservatives in Winnipeg, and we have 2 New Democrats in Winnipeg. Right. So you have a little bit of diversity within the city itself. That starts to become less diverse as you get into the rural areas of Manitoba and then, of course, Saskatchewan, where we don't hold any seats, and the 2 in Alberta. Right.
It's interesting. In the last campaign in 2021, we worked with a polling firm based out of the UK. They were Boris Johnson's pollsters, and they were the Australian Liberals, which is conservative pollsters. And they actually oversaw like the Brexit strategy and all that. So we hired them. They were our pollsters, and they did a massive poll of Canada. And they were stunned to see how progressive Western Canada actually is. It was one of the more other than the rest of Canada. It really stood out because they work in so many European countries where they didn't have that type of progressive vote that was there. So it's interesting how the party splits really impact you guys, where you have 2 parties on the left or center left. So that's interesting to see as well. At the same time, campaigns matter. I've seen massive leads here in Ontario in 2011. I remember Tim Hudak had a 20-point lead almost over Dalton McGuinty. And that campaign completely exploded. Yeah. And McGuinty got reelected. So, I know we have a lot of runway in front of us. So lots can happen. I think this time next year we'll know. I think we're going to go. I don't see why the NDP would support you for another budget. It makes no sense to me why they would, unless there's something really sweet in it that they need to tie themselves to. But if I'm the NDP, I'd say, well, just elect us as government and we'll put it in anyway. But I think we're there.
Yeah, you may very well be right on that point. very hard to predict, of course, but I don't think it's far-fetched to suggest that this time next year we could very well be into an election. Having said that, though, there are things that could drive the SACA agreement further into the fall with the election scheduled as it's supposed to be now, or perhaps the other way, which is that an event or a series of events occurs before the spring, and we end up in a situation where we don't even get to a budget, and the NDP decides it wants to defeat the government on a particular confidence bill. So very, very hard to predict, and that's the nature of minority governments, of course. And it's fascinating to be a part of a minority government. When I was here as a staffer in 2015, even things like the way committee worked, you never had to worry about a filibuster.
Right.
I shouldn't say that. A filibuster certainly can occur, but you didn't have to worry about, are we going to win this vote when it gets called to adjourn?
Yeah.
You knew where it was going, and now you have to work collaboratively with one of the other parties, whether it's almost never the Conservatives, it's sometimes the Bloc, and it's usually the NDP.
You can never trust the Bloc. They flip their votes like nothing. Like they'll tell you, they'll sit there, yep, no, I like this motion. They sit down and they vote against it. I've seen it, I've had it happen back in our days.
Yeah, I think it depends on the issue, and it depends on the personality. But I mean, you know how it goes. The whip calls one moment, or the House leader calls and says, something's changed, folks, and all of a sudden what you thought you were working with 15 minutes earlier is no longer what you're working with.
Right.
But it is very interesting. I think there's a lot of Canadians, as frustrating as I find, and I think most members would find the operation of a minority government to be, because of course you always want carte blanche to be able to move forward with the things you want to accomplish. I do think that there is a substantial percentage of the population that likes the fact that there is a minority government, because it forces political parties to have to see things differently. And I can't fault them for that.
The polling backs you up on that 100%. They like, I don't want to say coalition, they like parties cooperating and working together.
Absolutely.
Or at least they have. We'll see after, because you guys have had the most unique, the closest that Canada's ever had to a coalition we've had right now, and we'll see if they like that going forward. But on the minority thing, I worked in government for 9 years. The most fun I had was the first 5 years in minority. Our first 5 years were minority government. It was the most, I mean, it was hectic, it was chaotic, it was stressful as hell, not knowing if your government was going to fall each session going into it. But that fired you up for work every day. It was a different feeling. When we lost steam when we got our majority government in 2011. We forgot who we were as a political entity.
That's interesting.
And that's a big part of why I think we lost in 15.
Let me ask you, just to turn the question over for a minute. In what ways, I mean, you've talked about having been around for 9 years under the Harper administration. In what ways have you seen changes in the culture and the policy direction of the Conservative Party from the beginning of Mr. Harper's tenure to the end of his tenure? Let's skip a couple of leaders and bring us to now.
Right.
Where have you seen that shift? And I don't mean in the country. I mean in the party, from your vantage point, in terms of where they were and where they are now.
I think if I, like, going back to it, when we lost in 15, it was like, holy shit. We had all this opportunity to do all these things and we didn't do it. We didn't get it done. It's interesting where I believe, you know, Harper was a conservative leader who wanted to, again, he was elected with minority governments. So he needed a partner. You need a partner, whether it be the Bloc or the NDP or sometimes the Liberals in his first few years. I think Poilievre, if he gets a majority, it'll be transformative change. That's what he's going to be looking for to do. And I know Poilievre was someone who was advocating for that during the Harper years, was real change on, and I don't know exactly what that means and exactly what he's going to do, but I think that's the perspective and what they're going to look to aim for.
Do you think that there is a longing or a desire within the Conservative caucus or within the Conservative Party wholesale for that old progressive conservatism that we saw out of people like Brian Mulroney and Joe Clark, Scott Bryson in the early days? And is the reason that we're not seeing that because that's not who Pierre is, and people understand that they're on the precipice of perhaps gaining some ground, and that he's the guy, and if that's the vision that he has, they're going to go with it, and it doesn't make any sense to be pushing back? Or is that gone and the party has, in fact, just moved along with their leader to the right?
No, the Conservative Party is a massive coalition of many, many tribes. There's a lot to decode with the Conservative Party. There is countless numbers of different groups that you could fit yourself into. I could be here for a while explaining them all.
That may be true, but how many progressive conservatives are sitting in the front benches right now?
No, but I'm saying it's a tribe within the caucus and within the party. I'm not saying it's...
You're not saying that one's more dominant than other.
No, it is a big... we always say we're a big tent. There's lots of different types of conservatives. Yeah, but we mean it within the conservative context where there's so many different entities. Right now, though, like it's hard to argue with the leader when he's got the most historic lead we've ever seen. Yeah, and he is a very solid communicator. It's very bare bones. Like he goes right to the most simplistic words, but those are words that work. They're words that resonate with people. They're words that click. We're junkies. We're political animals. The vast majority of this country are not. So, if you zero in, and Poilievre is a true animal of this game, and he's been preparing for this for a very long time. I think from both the perspective of running for leader and then what he's going to do if he gets that majority. And some may say the majority could be the worst thing for him, where he doesn't put any water in his wine, where he just goes all in. And
that's an interesting point. But part of the reason I raise it, because you've jogged my memory with some of these questions about the by-election. And I can remember knocking on doors in a part of my riding called Tuxedo. Tuxedo
Love that name.
Is a more, it's an upper class part of the constituency. It's got a heavy Jewish population.
See, I never assumed, that's funny, with the name, I always assumed it wasn't. I assumed it was a more gritty.
Yeah, exactly. So it's getting written out of my boundaries, and Marty Morantz, who's the current Conservative member for Charleswood for short, which will become Winnipeg West. Marty's going to pick up Tuxedo, which is quite advantageous to him. But when I knocked on doors there, I was surprised at how responsive people were to the Liberal Party, because it's typically, so Heather Stephenson, the former Premier of Manitoba, that was her riding for 20 years provincially. And in fact, there's a by-election happening right now. The NDP, interestingly enough, in the last provincial election came within 200 votes of winning that seat, which is crazy.
Well, you're a terrible premier.
Yeah, fair enough. So we'll see where it goes. But one of the things I heard from people is they weren't necessarily fans of mine, fans of the parties. Maybe they didn't like the Prime Minister. But it was not uncommon for me to hear someone say, this is not my dad's Progressive Conservative Party. This is not my grandparents' Conservative Party. And that was a way of them articulating some discomfort that they had with Pierre and with the current party. Now, that didn't mean that they were going to become Liberals because of it, and I don't know what they ended up doing. Maybe some of them voted for me, maybe some of them voted for the Tories, maybe some of them stayed home. But it was just interesting that you started to hear for the first time this reflection from people who had voted Conservative in the past, now starting to kind of think about why, or what was that form of conservatism that they were willing to lend their support to over a number of years, that was now leading to them starting to ask a little bit of a question. So that's why I raised that particular point.
Right. It's interesting. Like if you look at Saskatchewan, a province where the NDP used to be very competitive and win a lot of seats in, or a number of seats, we've swept it 2 elections in a row. Harper never swept Saskatchewan. He never swept it, winning 3 elections in a row. We've lost the last 3 elections.
Thank you, Ralph Goodell.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but it's interesting, though, where we're holding it now, and the Prairie vote in some ways are solidifying in different areas. I don't know where that's going to go. I'm curious, the next election, the way it's lining up, what's going to be bigger, the Quebec Conservative Caucus or the Liberal Prairie Caucus? Or Atlantic Caucus for Conservatives too, where we've been, we used to we won the Maritimes in 2011, and we got wiped out in 15. I don't know if there's a wipeout in any areas in the country for the Liberals, if that'll ever happen. Or
yeah, it's so hard to say. Again, back to something we were talking about a couple of minutes ago. People, when not faced with a choice, can say a variety of different things. And that's what polls are based off of. I talked earlier about being a teacher, being a principal.
Right. 4
times a year, what does a kid get? They get a report card. And I used to have parents come in, particularly grade 9 parents. I can remember it vividly. And it's remember your first report card in grade 9? Your parents probably lost their minds, right?
No, my parents were quite happy. Sorry, I don't know what you're
Okay, well, maybe it's
I'm kidding.
Maybe it was just the 56% in whatever I got that they weren't too happy about. I got the credit, but
my parents were listening to saying, that's not true.
Yeah. I would sit down with parents and I would say, Mr. Smith, it's okay. This is a snapshot in time. That's what I would talk about a report card being. It's a snapshot in time. It tells us where your son or your daughter has been in the last couple of months. And then we would have conversations that would go something like, if the following things continue, Mr. Smith, then there may be an acceleration of that trend line in a direction that you're not pleased with.
Right.
But if the following changes are made, or if the following things happen, we're going to see a very different looking report card in terms 2, 3, or 4. Now, I'm not trying to transpose that analogy into the current political context.
I think it's a great analogy to transpose.
However, well, yeah, because you want to pick up on the trend line.
Well, it's a year of bad marks. What do you do?
But the point that I'm making is that it's not until the final moment, the final poll, which of course is election day, that you can get a true assessment of what that period of time that you are assessing looks like. Right. So have we had a couple of terms, to go back to the analogy, that have been challenging and things are trending in a direction that requires some changes? Absolutely. Does that tell us what the mark on the final exam is going to be? No, it doesn't.
Right. And I think the next big report card is going to be St. Paul's, and June 24th. I can't wait to see what those numbers say. And if the trend continues to go, someone may need to drop out of school soon. But with that, thanks so much for coming in. This was a really fun chat.
Thanks, Freddie.
Enjoyed it a lot.
I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, folks, thanks so much for listening in. Another great podcast on Background. Our last episode turned into a story on the National Post, which was great to see, and then the National News Watch picked it up. So maybe I said some controversial things this time. We'll see. So again, thanks for tuning in, and don't forget to subscribe and tune in to next week's episode of On Background.